is an Indian writer and journalist who currently lives in New York City. Yashica has written on a broad range of topics including fashion, gender, identity, culture, and caste. She was previously working as a principal correspondent with Brunch, Hindustan Times in New Delhi. Keshava Guha is a writer of fiction and literary and political journalism. Born in Delhi and raised in Bangalore, he studied history and politics from Harvard and also has an MA in creative and life writing from Goldsmiths, University of London. He writes regularly on politics for Scroll.in and on books for The Hindu and Literary Review. He has also contributed to the Wall Street Journal, Hindustan Times, Time Out, Caravan, Business Standard, and Night Watchman. His debut novel, Accidental Magic, is set in Boston in the early 2000s in a community of adult Harry Potter obsessives and has received critical and popular acclaim. We also have small token of appreciations for our panelists from Tata Steel, our title sponsor. So, sir and ma'am.
So it's really an honor and a treat to be here to have the chance to discuss Yashica Dutt's really extraordinary memoir, coming out as Dalit. Literary taste is a subjective thing in non-fiction as in fiction, and one can't usually say that everybody should read this book. But this is one of the books of which I can say to all of you, whatever sorts of books you like to read, you should read this. Now, this book it's really three books in one, but sort of fused seamlessly into one. So there's the memoir. I mean, it's sort of, it says, you see on the cover, it's a memoir. It's a memoir of Yashica, of her family. It's also an analysis and history of caste, from using history, politics, sociology, incorporating insights from all of those disciplines. And finally, it's a collective memoir, because Yashica started something called Documents of Dalit Discrimination, and you hear voices of sort of dozens of other people who've had similar experiences, and they also add to the book. I think of it as kind of like a Greek chorus. So it's many voices that sort of merge into one. So why don't you tell us about, because this is a book that has a backstory, not just in your life, but there's a very particular way it came to be into being. So it'd be great if you could tell us how the book happened, and then also why you decided to write it in this very original way, these three books in one.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Keshava. It's an honor to be here. It's only my second time in Calcutta, and thank you so much for having me over. This book definitely has a backstory. First being that I never wanted to write books. I'd never thought of myself as an author. I was a journalist. I was trained to be one. And I grew up, as the book, for those of you not familiar, I grew up hiding my caste. A lot of Dalits do that. And the reason we feel compelled to hide our caste is because it saves us from the blatant discrimination most of us feel. And I grew up as a journalist, never thinking that books are going to be in my future. If somebody asked me what my caste was, my question would be, I'm Brahmin, sometimes it would be Punjabi, sometimes, I didn't know about castes except I needed to hide mine. And then I worked here for a decade or so in journalism, and I moved to the US for a grad school degree. And that's where for the first time, I realized that I didn't have to think about my caste. It was there that I finally got freedom from the constant question of being asked, what is your caste? But aapki caste kya hai? After every little conversation, that would be the second question. And then when I got some distance is when I was able to reflect and understand, why am I accepting this system that basically has no logic? What decides who is upper, who's lower, who's equal or not? And I just accepted it as my reality forever. And I write about this in the book. At one of my classes at Columbia, I was surrounded by students. They were talking about their experiences with racism, sexuality. And I heard them and I thought about talking about my caste. But internal casteism is such a brutal force of oppression that I thought, oh, but maybe my experience is not that valid. Maybe racism is worse than having to hide my caste or facing the kind of discrimination that I do. But when I spoke about it and I saw my classmates' faces, they reflected absolute shock and horror. And that was when I realized what I've been going through is a form of extreme trauma. What a lot of Dalits go through is a form of extreme trauma. And I was still reflecting upon these questions when I heard about in 2016 that Rohit Vemula had been institutionally murdered. And I avoided reading that for a long time because I knew I needed to sit down and read what he had written. And I sat down one cold evening, it was snowing outside, sat in front of my laptop and read that letter, and that letter shook me to the core. I read that once, and I read that twice, and I realized that that could have been me. If circumstances were slightly different, I could have been in his place, being forced to take my own life. And the key difference between us was he decided to speak out. He decided to make himself heard. He decided to stand for what's right. And here I was, having spent a somewhat relatively easier life in journalism, having been to Colombia, and not doing anything about who I was. And that's when I decided to come out. And I use the words come out because it was like being in a closet of your own caste. And the kind of burden that comes with hiding your identity felt very similar. So I wrote a Facebook note, and I decided to start a Tumblr. Because I realized as a journalist, if we were even to speak about caste, the spaces were so dominant with this conversation about reservation. Do we deserve it? Do we not deserve it? What is it like? So I wanted to create a space where we could just go and discuss the trauma of being Dalit, the trauma of having to face this persistent discrimination that comes with being born as a lower caste person. And I launched this Tumblr, and I realized that I had to put my story first. And I did. I decided to tell everybody that I was from the Valmiki Bhangi caste. And that note went viral, and that's how I got the book deal.
So, Rohit Vemula, well, I mean, one of the tragic ironies there is that, after he was compelled to take his own life, his family have been persecuted on the grounds that they're allegedly not actually Dalit. So it's like it's a very tragic case of how you lose. It's you lose either way. But so he's one of the two people to whom the book is dedicated, and I want to ask you about the other person. The other person is your mother, and so Yashica's mother is, in many ways, the heroine of this book. I hope you don't think you mind me saying that. She is someone of absolutely unshakable will, determination, optimism, sometimes naive optimism, right? In no matter the face of she's a dreamer and a hoper, and her hopes and dreams are continuously frustrated. But she's eventually vindicated, because essentially all of her dreams are directed towards generating a better future for Yashica and her siblings, particularly through the English language and more broadly through education. But she's also the person who in a way drives the action, because you didn't decide to hide your caste. That was a decision that was made for you, probably before you were born. And the project of transcending caste is very much her project. Right. So tell us more about this quite amazing person and what drives her and how she kept going through all of this.
Right. So before I even go into how my mother raised us, I just want to talk about yesterday. Before I flew here from Delhi, I was speaking to her, and we were talking about this yesterday. And I told her, she knows that I'm speaking at a bunch of places, and we were just talking, and she's read the book, but she's not read it cover to cover. And she didn't know that I've mentioned about the intricate details of her life, the kind of details that she had worked so hard to hide. For example, that till 2 generations ago, people in my family went to do the cleaning work that is assigned to us by a caste. And she's worked really hard to hide that detail. And when I told her that it's in the book, she's like, no, you cannot say that. And I was like, well, everybody kind of knows already. So I think it's public detail now. And she said, but that's not true. And I was like, Sure, if that's what you want to think. Um, but in terms of how she drives the narrative of my life, actually, was by telling us that, you know, a lot of the interpretation of one interpretation of the book is that she kind of forced me to hide and like create this alternate identity. But you have to, you know, one of the things that I want to point out is that in early 90s, being a Dalit person, being a woman in Rajasthan was a contested identity of its own. And if I needed to be able to pass or have any sense of equality, or any sense of dignity, any sense of pride, then I needed to not be Dalit, at least in a public sense. And that's why she would tell me, if anyone asks what your caste is, just tell them Brahmin. Or just tell them you don't know what your caste is, because you know a lot of the upper caste people can choose to be unaware of their caste. They can choose to be caste blind and say, well, we are so progressive that we are beyond caste. Dalits don't have that privilege. But also, like, speaking of her own life, her own narrative was driven by trying to find dignity and pride growing up as a young girl in a really small village, essentially, in Uttar Pradesh. And Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the northern politicization of caste, but Rajasthan's pretty bad, and so is Uttar Pradesh. So growing up there, being told by the society that the work that your parents do, the work that your mother does, how your dad is struggling, who you are, is not worthy of respect, is not worthy of equality, is not worthy of pride. And trying to find or snatch pride from the jaws of this blatant, aggressive system was basically her life's purpose. And for her, the only way to do that, and not just for her, but even her father, the only way to do that was to conceal who you were. I remember when my mother's father, my grandfather, came to Delhi for a brief period to work. He passed off as a Christian person with a name, he took a name as Victor. He called himself Victor. And of course he was found out because 2 generations ago, our skills to pass weren't as developed as mine were.
But you describe this in some detail in the book. It was not a question of pretending to be upper caste. It was a question of living that way, right? So from rituals to food to dress, and all of that. And what are the differences between, it's a very moving moment in the book when Yashica has written this, not the book, but the note, right? Which she comes out, and she says to her mother that I've told the world. And her mother says, Jeete raho beta, right? So it's a very moving moment. But then at the same time, your mother, because of the world that she's grown up in, still has a kind of internalized shame about her own caste, which you are free from.
It took a long time for me to be free from it. It took me a lifetime of, as long as my life is so far, a lifetime of struggle, moving to the United States, seeing how maybe other societies validate systemic oppression, and then coming to terms with who I was. It took 2 generations of passing off as upper caste for me to reckon with being free of the shame. But I think it's fair for somebody like my mother who, had a master's degree, but essentially was a victim of patriarchy in her own home, was not allowed to work, felt this deep sense of shame about where she came from, and internalized that. And I internalized that for a really long time as well. And am I free from it entirely? I think now I am. And the reason I can say that is because I have models like Rohit Vemula or Chandrasekhar Azad, for that example. People like them are asserting their Dalit identity in such a strong, positive, and fundamental way that it's hard to draw any kind of shame from that. But before that, it was a struggle for me to. I remember when the first time I told one of my close friends that I was a Dalit person and in my exact caste, I really thought she was going to stop being friends with me. And I told her, hey, listen, I hope we're still friends. I have a big secret to tell you. And she was like, what have you done? Why are why are you so anxious? And I said, well, I'm just really worried, but this is something I need to tell you. If you don't want to be friends with me, I understand. Maybe your value system is different. And she's like, no, what is it? And I told her, I'm from an SC caste. I couldn't even say the word bhangi. I still, when I'm saying it right now, I feel a little tremor in my stomach saying bhangi, because there's so much shame that's attached to this word. And I think it's a process. I'm learning to be free from this kind of internalized shame. I worked at it about 90%, but I don't think my mother is there yet.
So actually, your mentioning the US actually is a great segue to the next thing I wanted to ask you about. So as I mentioned at the start, it's not just a memoir, it's also an analysis of caste, right? And many recent contemporary writers have drawn links between caste and race. Some of you may have read a book by Suraj Yengde called Caste Matters, which does this in some detail. And I was very struck by the way that you do this, because you don't try to draw parallels, but you draw in useful insights that we can use. So, and the one that I think is very original is the question of reparations. So you cite Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's a very well-known American writer on race, and who wrote an essay that went viral a few years ago called "The Case for Reparations," right, in the American context. And as you say, like when you think about it, the case for reparations in India seems morally inarguable, right? And reservation, in a way, could be seen as a small part of reparations. So do you see reservation as a form of reparations, and in what other forms did reparations take?
So I think before we get into that question, and I hope everybody here is on board with reservation, but if you're not, I just want to take you a couple of 100 years ago, before India was independent, and imagine a time when there is one-fourth of the population, almost Dalits, SCs, STs, and tribal people, don't have access to education, in fact are actively barred from accessing education, don't live in cities, probably don't have access to any kind of employment opportunities. Whereas on the other end are the upper castes, people who have had generations of education, people who have been able to not only go to schools, not only go to colleges and universities, are doing PhDs, are becoming lawyers, are going abroad. And this is just the 1800s. So the society is rapidly dividing into these two factions, one highly privileged in terms of how they're educated, and one just has no opportunity. So when India became a nation state in 1947 and we became a secular and a socialist state, the idea was to give every citizen an equal opportunity. But how would you give people who have no idea what it looks like to go to school an equal opportunity? What do you tell them? How do you at least create a little bit of a step ladder for them to maybe in the next 70, 80 years come at a level playing field of people who've had 3 generations of children go to the United States, go to London. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru had 3 generations of children who were studying abroad in the 1800s. And compare that to a Dalit person. People hadn't seen the inside of a classroom because Dalits couldn't sit inside a class and pick up a slate. So when you start with that, I think it's crucial, it's fundamental that you give everybody an equal opportunity to maybe make it a level playing field a century later, if not. And are those reparations? Absolutely. Are we owed an opportunity to have an equal stake in building this country? Of course we do. If India wants to call itself a democratic nation, which it still is, fingers crossed, we need an equal seat at the table. But in order to get that seat, we need a little bit of a ladder, and that's reservation. And reservation is just in government jobs, government schools, government universities. If we need to go beyond, we need to not look at, and let's not even call the word reservation. Words have meaning, right? Words carry so much weight. The word reservation has become attached with so much toxicity, so much negativity. Let's call it inclusion. and diversity, because that's exactly what it is. If you include 250 million people who have been essentially shut out from the private sector in more or less discriminatory ways, and you allow that workforce to enter, can you imagine the opportunities they'll be able to create? The wealth of talent, because this idea that talent is just concentrated in the upper caste is ultimately and inherently a casteist idea. So yes, reparations are owed. We need state-sponsored opportunities. We need the entire society to reckon with the fact that the opportunities that they've had so far didn't just come and fall in their lap because they worked really hard. It's because the society was constructed and created in a way that made sure that they were put at the pedestal where they are.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great points that Yashica makes in her book is she says, look, upper castes have enjoyed reservations forever, right? So first, we enjoyed reservations in the form of exclusion, right? So literally cornering all seats by excluding entire groups. And today it works through, as you say, a system of connections, right? So many jobs and opportunities are available to those who know the people that give those jobs out, and those networks are almost exclusively upper caste networks. So upper caste reservation is a very real, way before this government started saying they were giving reservation to upper caste, they were receiving reservations forever. So one of the stories in the book is about, one of the narratives in the book is about Ambedkar, your discovery of Ambedkar, of course, his analysis of caste. And something that struck me when I was reading it was that, in Ambedkar's lifetime, thanks to Ambedkar's others like him, Phule, Narayana Guru, Periyar, etc., India did make some strides, right? So there was one of those elite upper castes in the 1800s. If you told them in the year 1900 that by 1950 India would have a constitution that, with universal adult suffrage that mandated 22.5% reservation for SCs and STs, in which untouchability was illegal, they wouldn't believe it, right? I don't think any priest in 1900 would think that this world was possible. So India did make, between 1900 and 1950, bigger strides on this front than it had for millennia. Now, those strides were nowhere near enough, but they were a start. But if you look at the India today, I think you could make the case that the progress that we made in those 50 years has not continued, right? So you document in the book, Bayswater Wilson's work on how manual scavenging persists, and it's still overwhelmingly done by Dalits. You also, talk about how Dalits are underrepresented at every level of the professional classes. And in Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar says that the only way to annihilate caste is intermarriage. And all the surveys of intermarriage show that the percentage of people marrying across caste has not risen in about 50 years. So India remains a country where over 95% of people marry within their jati, right? Finally, and I'm very curious to know what you think about this. You have a government in power right now whose ideology is, in many ways, a Brahminical, Sanskritizing ideology, promotes vegetarianism, cow protection. There have been attacks, not by the government, but by groups ideologically friendly to them, attacks against Dalits. But yet, what you see is, in fact, that a lot of data says that larger numbers of Dalits are now voting for this government. I mean, some states maybe over 50%. And so how do you make sense of all? I mean, what went wrong after Ambedkar's death? And why does the dream of annihilating caste seem as far away as ever?
That's a really great question, and I've thought about it quite a bit, actually. What Ambedkar did in 1950 with the Constitution, and even the forefathers of the country, the founding fathers of the country, the project was, they understood that the people are not there yet. The people were never fully caste-free. The people weren't thinking, wow, okay, my fellow Dalit person, I'm going to come and eat at your house and marry my daughter with your son. That's not what was happening. There was a hope and there was a dream, because the 50s, from everything that we know now, was a progressive, hopeful time. World wars had just ended. India was becoming this new state. We wanted everybody to have a seat at the table. So we were able to enact these laws that really made us democratic in the true sense, that gave us all a sense of equality. But whether those laws would be fully enacted was something we needed to see. And as we've seen, of course, they haven't worked because casteism is a wild beast. It has morphed around those laws. It has morphed in a way that now those laws are almost anti-Dalit. For example, reservation. Reservation quota wale is a slur now. Jai Bhim wale is a slur now. And people haven't changed. The laws were there, but if we were thinking that just because, the SC/ST Prevention Act came in 1989, or the untouchability law came, or we had reservation, or we had seats in the parliament, then people will suddenly stop thinking that Dalits were untouchable. That was never the case. I think, and I want to go a little further and say that casteism has its roots in Hinduism. And as religious freedom is a personal choice. But as far as we want to examine our beliefs and see what is it that we are following. What are the scriptures saying, and what are we taking from them? And as long as we don't do that, we're never going to be caste free. As long as, and that project never happened in the 1950s. Nobody was going and writing tweets on Twitter back then. And I think that's happening now more than then. People are really examining their privilege, and I know it's a tired term, but I think it really quite accurately sort of talks about how people are beginning to understand that maybe what their parents have told them is not accurate. And as far as, Dalits voting for the government and center and why that has happened, I think for that we need to understand how the caste system works. And I'm sure all of us know that here, but just bear with me for a second. Ambedkar called it a descending scale of contempt. And what that means is the lower you go, the higher your contempt is. Even the person who is a caste above you will feel, just Hindi mein bolte hain ghrina. That's what, and there is really no English equivalent for that. They will feel that absolute disgust for you because you are lower than them. And that is a very fundamental Indianism. To kind of look down on a person who is below our caste is a very fundamental Indian value. So when the government comes in and offers Dalits a seat at the table, or at least paints this beautifully vivid picture that, we are going to make you Hindus. Think about how a person who all they wanted was to be included. Their lives they've spent thinking about, why do they hate us so much? And now this government comes and says, you know what? Come sit with us. You're Hindu. And of course, they will kick you out the moment they have an opportunity. But they're saying, you're just like us. We're all Hindus. Let's be empowered together. Why will a Dalit person not jump at that chance? Because internal casteism, as is internal racism, it rewards aligning with the majoritarian point of view, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's Hindu supremacy, whether it's casteism. When a Dalit person toes the line, they are rewarded. And a Dalit person who has spent their entire life being discriminated and is not conditioned to make decisions for themselves, as a lot of Indians are not, then it's quite evident which party they're going to vote for.
And on the point of contempt, of course, Bhangis face a lot of that from other Dalit groups, right? So I'm going to open up to questions in a second. I have I have many more questions. There's one that I'm going to ask you before we open up, and that is about how coming out has changed your life or has affected your life. And this because the thing about caste identity, particularly Dalit identity, is it's very different from the coming out metaphor reminds obviously of sexual identity or of gender identity. And in those cases, you're proudly owning something that you truly believe that you are. In this case, you're owning an identity that you wish didn't exist, right? Because you are committed, as I think any humane person is, to the annihilation of caste. And also because your mother had fought so hard for you to transcend this. So tell us about about what it's 3 years, 4 years now? 4 years that you've been out. And it's brought you into contact with hundreds of other people with similar experiences. So how has it changed you?
I think I truly feel like myself. I never really did. I was a journalist, and I remember I used to cover parties for HT and other magazines. And I never felt I belonged anywhere. Ever since I've been able to openly talk about my identity, and like I spoke earlier, I'm beginning to let go of the shame that came with being who I was. And now I'm at a public place, and I've been asked that question fairly recently about, oh, you seem really confident, and you seem really comfortable with yourself. I think in that sense, that closet or that manufactured closet that we all have, that people like me have in their heads, that does impose this idea that you're never going to be good enough, that you don't deserve to be anywhere. And in that respect, it's very similar, whether it's your sexuality, whether it's your gender. And of course, these are not perfect terms, and I'm not a perfect academic or an academic. But to me, it really made sense to give this terminology to this process, because that's how it felt. I was unburdening myself of this identity that I'd dragged behind my back pretty much all my life. And in terms of what you said, how do you assert this identity and yet be committed to annihilating caste? I think not just me, Rohit or Chandrasekhar Azad, or look at any other Dalit person living proud and free. It's a radical act. When we talk about being Dalit, when I sit on the stage and say, I'm from a Bhangi caste, I'm really changing perceptions. And I'm changing my own perceptions. I'm changing the perceptions of other people by ascribing a positive connotation to the word Bhangi. Otherwise, it's a slur. So as long as the society and the civil society and Indians in general, wherever they go, as long as they think of being Dalit or being a lower caste person as an untouchable identity, it is important for us to assert our identities in a positive way. Because we need to create a narrative that's not just one, that's not just this character that is from Lagan who's called Kachra. I think we need to create points where people can associate, this can also be a Dalit person, or that can also be a Dalit person. And I think for us to do that, we need to loudly and proudly say who we are. And maybe once people stop being shocked by that, it won't be necessary for us to keep asserting us as being Dalit. But until that happens, we need to keep saying that. And we can still be in the favor of annihilating caste and yet be prideful in who we are.
I guess just one thought on that, which is that I think it is a practical matter. It comes into your own life decision because, for example, if for you or your siblings, marrying across caste is the step towards gradually that identity dissipating, right? Anyway, so I said I do have more questions, but we're going to open up now because I know there are going to be several. So, yeah, and then.
So, ma'am, I have 3 questions for you.
So just very briefly introduce yourself before you ask the question.
I'm Swapnanil Datta. I'm a student of Jadavpur University.
Hi, Swapna.
So, I have 3 questions for you. First is, like Ambedkar has repeatedly spoken of how endogamy perpetuates the caste system. So I want to get a first-hand perspective that how does this narrative build up in a Dalit household? Like how is it internalized that you cannot marry outside? So I want to get a first-hand narrative of that. My second question would be, like now we are focusing on intersectional identities, right? So you are a Dalit woman. Being a woman, you are both, like there is patriarchy as well as caste.
Right.
And suppose your sexual orientation comes in, you're a lesbian. So how important do you think intersections are while judging oppression? And my third question is that you spoke of how the present government speaks of like, you are a Hindu too, and people are like voting for that government. But don't you also think that it is a subtle attempt at Sanskritization and Brahminization to bring you into that fold of the larger Hindu society? Because I was recently reading this book by Kancha Laya, Why I'm Not a Hindu. And I came to know that the experience of Dalit Bahujans are so much different than what, like the goddesses they worship, the food they have, the way they wear their dresses, the way they, there are no language terms in the modern literature which relate to the experience of a Dalit household. So, do you not think that it is a subtle attempt, to include you when you actually want to assert yourself independently? Like, is it not subsuming your identity when you want to say that, no, I am not a part of what you think me to be? So, these are my 3 questions.
You said you're from Jadavpur. Shout out to Jadavpur. Those are excellent questions. Wow. Really, really impressive. Okay, so I'll start. How have I seen endogamy take place in my household? We've spoken about my mother a little bit. And one of the things that Rajasthan is also highly patriarchal. Like to the extent that when I was born, they said, that's it, no more girls, or too many girls, or maybe why is she even a girl? So that's why she didn't fuel our minds, both me and my sisters, with ideas of marriage and who you're supposed to marry. So in a deeply personal way, I didn't really think about who I was going to marry or what should be the prescriptive way to transcend caste via marriage. I'm not sure if I want to get married.
So really quickly, also because she was lied to.
Of course.
It's very briefly, like her mother, Yashica's mother's one desire was that she would marry someone who didn't drink. And she was told before her marriage that her prospective husband was a teetotaler, and that turned out to be a tragic lie.
Yeah, my dad was an alcoholic. So she just did not want to focus on marriage at all. But I know from other Dalit households that there is this conversation about how is it when you marry a Dalit girl into an upper caste family versus how is it when you marry a Dalit boy into an upper caste family in heterosexual marriages, right? So the consensus is that if you give a Dalit girl, in a strictly patriarchal sense, if you give your daughter to an upper caste family, she is going to suffer. And that's one point of view that a lot of Dalit households have. But if your son is getting an upper caste girl in the fold, then it's a win, which is quite gross in itself, right? And your second question was intersectionality. Absolutely crucial, and I'm so glad this conversation is happening because being a Dalit, being a woman, and for people who are queer, I think all those identities are contested and they need to assert them in different ways because does the Dalit movement make space for Dalit women? Does it make space for Dalit queer people? Does it make space for Dalit non-binary people? Those are all questions that we need to challenge ourselves and constantly talk about. And this idea that that's not true. I think at this point in the conversation where we are globally in 2020, we need to talk about all these identities and only then we can really create a just society. At least that's the hope for everybody. And you said about Sanskritization and Brahminization of Dalits. Absolutely. And it's when I talked about that earlier, I think we can still approach why Dalits vote for the party that they do with a sense of empathy, but also criticize that and also bring nuance to that conversation and say, maybe you should not be doing that. Maybe you should be reflecting and be thinking about what is it that makes you a fuller individual person? Getting a seat at the table, which is ultimately going to be next probably their feet, or having a separate table on your own. So, the question of Brahminization, the question of retaining a separate Dalit identity, I think is a critical question. And as I consider it a responsibility. And I'm sure a lot of us also think about how we can talk more about Dalits taking pride in themselves. Having the freedom to follow whatever the religion they want, whatever faith they want, but also at the same time, having the acumen to judge about if a party is telling them, if a political party, if a political outfit, or if anybody is telling them, be a Hindu and you'll be you'll be an equal, how valid or accurate is that? That's something that as Dalit public faces, we have a responsibility to reckon with.
Yeah. You had a question, right? Yeah. Get on the mic. Yeah.
First of all, Yashica, absolutely wonderfully insightful, remarkable. And Keshava, you've been asking the most perceptive questions. So it's been a great teamwork. Very quickly, I'm Dr. Julie Mehta. I teach cultural studies and world literature in post-colonial literature at the University of Toronto. It's really strange that you should bring up Colombia, and that's where you are, because Gayatri Spivak is, a front and center guru of ours, and you've done very well to explicate issues of minority and, the margins. Now, my question is very direct. When I taught Prem Chand at York University, 3 of the students in my class were Dalit, and one was, by her own confession, a Bhangi. There were a lot of tears in the class, and those questions hadn't been confronted before. Do you think that in the diaspora, are we self-censoring in families still, and still inventing tradition to keep especially Dalit women within a paradigmatic geography? Or do you think it's easier for people like you, who are self-empowered, I would say, to break those ceilings? So is the diaspora working?
Thank you so much. I'm so impressed with this audience, wow. My experience is unique because I, for whatever reasons, had the freedom to be able to leave Delhi, leave India, and go and build an independent life. But for somebody who perhaps moved there with their parents or were born and raised there, even as a Dalit woman, and especially in the diaspora, for those of us who live abroad, might be familiar with this experience that Indians want to preserve all their Indianness. And like I said earlier, one of the fundamentals of Indianness is casteism. So they want to preserve that caste hierarchy. And in fact, I'm sure you must be familiar with the California textbook law. What happened there was a bunch of upper caste Indians protested against California textbooks talking about caste because they said that white kids and non-Indian kids are using that to bully Indian kids and say, oh, look at you, you have caste in your country. Instead of teaching their children about why caste is wrong, how they can educate them, how they should be empowered and acknowledge their history like the Germans do. They were saying remove the mention of caste altogether. They also said remove the mention of sati. They also said remove the mention of how India tends to treat its women. So there were other things, but among one of the main things that they wanted removal was of caste. So the diaspora, and in fact, I want to share this incident that happened with me a few days ago. A freelance journalist contacted me for an interview, and it was about the book, talking about caste. I sent my questions to her, and she wrote back to me saying that, sorry, the editor has refused to run it. And the exact quote was, because as a minority in the United States, we have a responsibility to preserve the image of India in the world. And that's why I have steered very clear from caste conversations, because I don't want, quote unquote, white people to think that's all we are. But my question to that was, isn't that what we are? Aren't we ultimately a casteist society? We can come to terms with it and change it, but ultimately that's who we are. Yes, the diaspora is working actively to preserve caste and caste hierarchies, in my experience.
So we do have time for 1 or 2 more quick questions. Anyone? Yeah.
My question is, giving more...
Please introduce yourself.
My name is Mohammad Shahnawaz. Would giving more seats in parliament our political percentage would be adding some benefit to Dalit community. If more freedom in politics, more seats are given, would that add any benefit?
I'm going to add my own question on top of that, which is, do you think the Ambedkar's conception of separate electorates has any salience today? Or was it just of its time?
Right, thank you for that question. Thanks, Keshava. So I think when Ambedkar talked about separate electorates, and I'll come to your question, it was, like I've talked about before, it was a different time. The Dalit populace was politically charged. It might not be as educated as it is today, but there was, the mood of the nation was, we all want rights. So when he talked about separate electorates and he said, we will contest Dalit leaders and we will have Dalits elect them so they can only act in the interest of the representatives, that was a valid idea. Now, 70 years later, when political identities can easily be swayed, I'm not sure how fruitful that would be. And to come to your question about would adding more seats make a difference, I'm sure it would make somewhat of a difference, but I think what would make more of a difference is to have an empowered electorate, is to have people understand what's politically correct for them. What is the political way forward for them that will give them the equality that they've been looking for? People can have more Dalit seats at the table and elect these dummy representatives who act against the interest of the electorate, and that's not going to solve anything. But what we need is and I know I'm asking for a tall order here, but we need a complete the social order to really examine, including Dalits, about what is the way for us going forward, more than anything else.
So I'm guessing that way before reservation, it starts with an overhaul of education, right? Which is, I mean, the biggest difference we can make to Dalit lives probably is school education, government school education from sort of class 1, which is where we've really failed the electorate, right? Okay, so I think we have to wrap up there. I think that Yashica's talk has given you a sense, of how insightful she is, as well as what a great storyteller she is, and this is a book that is very moving. It's a great story, but it's also truly an education. And I think that, as I said at the start, it is that very rare book of which one can say everybody should read it. You can pick it up. Copies are available here, but also I think Yashica is available here if you want to ask her questions about the book, one-on-one. So, yeah. Anyway, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.